If life had been fair, Emily Carter would have had parents to kiss her goodnight, a home filled with warmth, and dreams that didn't taste like hunger. But life had never been fair to her. At just 6 years old, she watched everything she loved vanish in a single night, a twisted wreck of metal on a rainy highway, sirens screaming in the dark. From that moment, Emily was labeled what society never lets you forget, an orphan. Now, at 22, she was still fighting shadows. No family. No wealth. No safety net. Just her will to survive in a city that didn't care whether she sank or swam. But what Emily didn't know was that fate was about to throw her into the path of the one man who could either save her or destroy her. His name? Alexander Reid. Boston's youngest billionaire CEO. A man the world called the Ice King. And in less than 24 hours, their worlds would collide inside a ballroom where dreams and power clashed under glittering chandeliers. Emily sat hunched on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the faint cracks in her ceiling. The city hummed outside, distant sirens, the low growl of traffic, laughter spilling from a bar across the street. Life moved on, indifferent to the girl who was holding her breath between survival and collapse. Her shift at the cafe had ended hours ago, yet the ache lingered in her feet. Her paycheck would barely cover rent. Again. She pressed a hand against her stomach as it growled, half amused, half resigned. Hunger had been a constant companion since childhood, sometimes sharp, sometimes dull, but always there, like a ghost she could never banish. Still, she refused to let the world break her. Tomorrow was just another day, she told herself. Another shift. Another chance. Another battle with the city that had swallowed so many others like her. But tomorrow would not be just another day. Because across town, beneath the glow of Boston's tallest skyscraper, Alexander Reid was preparing for the annual Winter Gala, a gathering of the city's most powerful and elite. It was an event of shimmering gowns, whispered alliances, and ruthless negotiations disguised as polite conversation. He loathed it. But appearances were everything, and Alexander Reid never faltered. His enemies called him cold, heartless. His board called him brilliant. The world called him untouchable. And yet, as he adjusted the cufflinks on his tailored suit, he wondered if anyone had ever truly seen him, not the CEO, not the Ice King, but the man. He doubted it. The night stretched ahead, destined to glitter with excess and ambition. He didn't know that among the strangers who would wander into that ballroom, one young woman with no gown, no fortune, and no right to be there, would soon unravel the armor he had spent years perfecting. For Emily Carter and Alexander Reid, fate's clock was already ticking. And when it struck, nothing in either of their lives would ever be the same again. The Winter Gala sparkled like something pulled from a dream. Boston's most elite arrived in sleek black cars, their designer gowns and tuxedos catching the glow of chandeliers even before they stepped inside. The hotel's grand ballroom stretched endlessly, arched ceilings painted in gold leaf, crystal lights dripping like frozen rain, and the hum of an orchestra weaving seamlessly with the laughter of the powerful. Emily Carter didn't belong here. She knew at the moment she stepped through the side entrance, her thrift shop dress brushing nervously against her knees. The soft lavender fabric was clean but plain, out of place among silks and sequins. The shoes she wore pinched her toes, and the string of pearls around her neck wasn't real, it was borrowed from a kind coworker who insisted she deserved to shine at least once. Emily had no invitation. No claim to the life behind those gleaming doors. But she had determination and a reason. The gala was more than a party. It was an opportunity. Billionaires, investors, and CEOs all gathered under one roof, sipping champagne and talking deals that could change the course of entire companies. If she was lucky, if she played it just right, she could slip into conversations, maybe find a chance to beg for work, a contact, anything that could drag her life out of the shadows. Her heart pounded as she slipped past a distracted usher. No one stopped her. No one looked twice. For the first time in her life, she was inside a world built for kings and queens. On the far side of the ballroom, Alexander Reid stood like a fortress among men. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in an immaculate black suit that seemed cut from shadow itself, he was magnetic even in his stillness. People circled around him, executives, socialites, women draped in diamonds, all vying for a sliver of his attention. But Alexander's face was unreadable, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room with a detachment that chilled. They called him the Ice King for a reason. He never smiled, never faltered, never allowed anyone close enough to see the man beneath the empire. Until his gaze fell on her. Emily didn't notice him at first. She was too busy avoiding waiters, too busy clutching her borrowed clutch like a lifeline. Her nerves screamed, telling her she didn't belong. But then she felt it, that sharp prickle at the back of her neck, the weight of eyes locking onto her. She glanced up. And froze. Across the sea of glittering gowns and tuxedos, Alexander Reid was staring directly at her. His expression was carved from stone, yet there was something dangerous in the way he looked at her, like a man who had seen through masks his entire life, and for the first time, found one that intrigued him. Emily's breath caught. She tore her eyes away, heat rising to her cheeks. Why on earth would Boston's most powerful man look at her like that? She wasn't anyone. She wasn't even supposed to be here. Champagne, miss? A waiter asked, startling her. She shook her head, muttering a polite no before hurrying toward the far edge of the ballroom. Her plan had been simple: blend in, gather courage, and find someone approachable enough to beg for a chance. But now she felt like every eye was on her. Especially his. Alexander watched as she slipped through the crowd, her dress too modest, her pearls too fake. She was an outsider. He knew it instantly. And yet, he couldn't look away. There was something raw about her, something unpolished and real in a room full of masks. He didn't believe in fate. He believed in power, in control. But as she disappeared behind a column of marble, he found himself moving. Slowly, deliberately, the Ice King crossed the ballroom, his presence parting the crowd like a tide. Emily hadn't meant to run. She only wanted a moment to breathe. Her palms were damp, her chest tight with nerves. She leaned against the column, trying to steady herself. Then a voice cut through the noise, deep and cool, carrying an authority that made her spine stiffen. "You don't belong here." She spun around. And there he was, Alexander Reid, towering, his sharp gaze pinning her in place like a butterfly caught beneath glass. Her lips parted, but no words came. Because in that single moment, Emily Carter realized two things. One, Alexander Reid wasn't a man you could lie to. And two, her life was no longer hers to control. Emily's throat tightened as the words hung between them. "You don't belong here." Her instincts screamed at her to run, to disappear into the crowd before the security guards were summoned. But her pride, fragile, stubborn, and bruised too many times, forced her chin upward. I was invited," she lied, her voice small but steady. Alexander Reid's eyes narrowed. He didn't move closer, yet his presence felt overwhelming, like the room itself bent around him. He had spent years building empires, dismantling liars with a single glance. He could see through her flimsy excuse as easily as glass. "Try again," he said, voice calm but edged like a blade. Her heart hammered. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing down, yet something inside her snapped. "Does it matter?" she whispered, then louder, braver. "Does it matter if I belong? Or are you the one who decides who's worthy of breathing the same air in this place?" For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The orchestra played on, crystal laughter filled the ballroom, but none of it touched the space between them. Emily couldn't believe she'd just challenged Alexander Reid, the most untouchable man in Boston. And yet, his mouth curved. Not into a smile, not quite. But a flicker of something, amusement? Curiosity, crossed his face. "You're bold," he said quietly, tilting his head as though studying a puzzle. "Foolish. But bold." Emily's legs trembled, but she refused to look away. If she bowed now, if she let him see her fear, she'd lose everything. He took a step closer. The air shifted, colder, heavier. "This world will eat you alive," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "The moment they see weakness, you're finished. And yet, here you are, uninvited, standing in front of me like you have nothing left to lose." Her lips parted, words tumbling before she could stop them. "That's because I don't." The honesty in her voice startled even her. But it was the truth. She had nothing, no family, no wealth, no safety net. Just a fire in her chest and the stubborn will to survive. Something flickered in Alexander's eyes, sharp as lightning breaking through a storm. He wasn't used to this, people didn't speak to him this way. They cowered. They obeyed. Yet this woman, this nobody in a thrift store dress, had just thrown her soul at his feet. For the first time in years, Alexander Reid didn't know what to do with the feeling tightening in his chest. Before he could respond, a woman's voice called across the ballroom. "Alexander! Darling, there you are!" A statuesque blonde glided toward him, diamonds dripping from her wrists. She slipped her hand onto his arm, her red lips curving into a practiced smile. "The investors are waiting. You can't keep them." Alexander's gaze lingered on Emily a moment longer, unreadable, before he turned slightly toward the blonde. "Of course." His tone was polite, smooth, automatic. But just as the socialite began leading him away, Alexander's hand slipped into his pocket. Without looking back, he dropped something onto the small marble table beside Emily. A glint of silver under the chandelier. Emily's eyes widened. A business card. Her trembling hand picked it up after he disappeared into the crowd. On it, embossed in clean, sharp letters. Alexander Reid, CEO, Reid Enterprises. And beneath it, a private number. Her breath caught. The Ice King had just opened a door. But was it an invitation, or a warning? Emily barely remembered how she got home that night. The glittering chandeliers of the Boston ballroom still shimmered in her mind, but the only thing that mattered was the small rectangle of silver card now resting on her nightstand. Alexander Reid. Boston's Ice King. The man who could ruin her with a single word. She sat on the edge of her bed in her tiny Cambridge apartment, peeling paint on the walls and the faint hum of traffic outside her window. A place so far removed from the grandeur of the ballroom it felt like another universe. Her fingers brushed the card again. "Call me." That's what it felt like it said, though he'd never spoken the words. Why would a man like him give his number to someone like her? Part of her wanted to rip it in half, toss it into the trash with the other reminders of things she could never have. But another part, the louder, reckless part, wondered if fate had just cracked open a door she was never meant to see behind. She pressed the card flat against her palm, her heart thudding. What would I even say if I called him? "Hi, remember me, the girl who didn't belong in your world?" But before she could decide, reality hit harder than her doubts. The rent notice pinned to her fridge. The overdue electricity bill folded neatly on the counter. The shift schedule at the downtown diner where she worked double hours just to stay afloat. Boston was an expensive city. And life had no mercy. By morning, she convinced herself she'd imagined it all, that she'd never call. She shoved the card into her bag and left for her shift. The diner in South Boston smelled of frying bacon and burnt coffee. The kind of place where truckers, cops, and exhausted students came in at all hours. Emily tied on her apron, plastered on a smile, and tried to forget the card burning a hole in her purse. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with her. Because just after noon, the diner bell chimed and silence rippled through the room. Emily froze, tray in hand, as he walked in. Alexander Reid. The Ice King. In a crisp charcoal suit that didn't belong anywhere near the cracked vinyl booths and sticky counters of McCafferty's diner. Every eye in the place followed him, but his gaze found only one. Hers. Emily's stomach dropped. He stepped forward, unbothered by the stares, his presence commanding the room without a word. When he reached her table, he didn't sit. He simply looked down at her, his voice low, steady. "You didn't call." The tray trembled in her hands. "I." "Sit," he said, nodding to the booth. "We need to talk." Her co-workers gaped. Customers whispered. Emily's pulse thundered as she slid into the booth, trying to breathe. Alexander Reid, billionaire CEO of Reid Enterprises, sat across from her in a rundown diner in South Boston. And Emily Carter's world was about to change forever. The hum of the diner pressed in around them, clattering dishes, the hiss of the grill, the buzz of whispered voices, but at their booth, it felt like the world had gone still. Emily sat stiffly across from him, her apron still tied, her hands clenched in her lap. Her heart was a drumbeat against her ribs. Alexander Reid didn't belong here. His tailored suit, the cool authority in his posture, the quiet intensity in his eyes, it was like Wall Street had dropped into South Boston for a cup of burnt coffee. "You didn't call," he repeated, voice like smooth steel. Emily swallowed hard. "I didn't think you were serious." His mouth curved, but it wasn't quite a smile. "I don't do things I'm not serious about." Her pulse stuttered. "Then why me?" As if reading her thoughts, he leaned forward, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I have an offer. Not charity, not pity, business. You'll be compensated fairly." Emily blinked. "Business?" "You intrigued me," he said simply. "Last night at the gala, you weren't supposed to be there, yet you held your ground. Everyone else in that room was clawing for my attention. You were different. Genuine." Her cheeks burned. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a warning. "I have a project," he continued. "A deal in New York that requires someone the press won't expect. Someone real." His gaze sharpened. "I think that person is you." Emily's stomach twisted. "Why me?" "You don't even know me." "That's precisely why. You're not part of their world. You're untouched by it. And that makes you valuable." Valuable. The word echoed in her mind. All her life, she'd been labeled a burden, a nobody. Now, this man, the Ice King himself, was looking at her like she was the missing piece to a puzzle worth billions. She wanted to laugh, to tell him he had the wrong girl. But then she thought of her fridge back in Cambridge, nearly empty. The rent notice. The overdue bills. New York, she repeated quietly. Yes. Manhattan. A business dinner next Friday. I want you there. Emily stared at him, trying to imagine herself in Manhattan, dressed in something more than her thrift store wardrobe, dining with billionaires who probably never spilled coffee on themselves rushing to the subway. It was insane. Impossible. Dangerous. But when Alexander Reid looked at her with those piercing gray eyes, something in her whispered, "This is the moment that changes everything." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "And if I say no?" For the first time, a flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Then I'll respect that. But something tells me you won't." He slid a sleek black credit card across the table. Not to her hand, but to the edge of her tray. "Buy something to wear. Manhattan doesn't forgive hesitation." And then he stood, leaving the diner as swiftly as he'd entered, his presence trailing behind him like frost. Emily sat frozen, the black card gleaming under the harsh diner lights. New York. Manhattan. Alexander Reid. Her world had just tilted off its axis, and she had no idea if it was towards salvation or ruin. The bus ride from Boston to New York had felt like crossing into another lifetime. Emily pressed her forehead against the window as the city skyline came into view, jagged steel and glass rising like a promise, or maybe a threat. Manhattan. The city that never slept. And now, the city where her fate was waiting. She clutched her thrift store duffel bag tighter to her chest, the only luggage she owned. The black card Alexander Reid had left her still felt like it burned a hole in her pocket. She hadn't dared to use it, afraid the cashier would laugh in her face, or worse, that it wasn't meant for her at all. Instead, she wore the nicest dress she owned, one she'd bought from a consignment shop in Cambridge years ago. A pale blue slip of fabric that whispered pretty but screamed out of place. The bus hissed to a stop at Port Authority. Emily stepped out into the chaos, taxis honking, steam rising from subway grates, people moving with the confidence of those who belonged. She wrapped her coat tighter, trying to look like she had a destination. But then, a black car slid to the curb. A driver stepped out, holding a placard with her name scrawled across it. Emily Carter. Her throat went dry. Alexander Reid hadn't just expected her, he had planned for her. The ride uptown was a blur of neon and glass. When the car finally stopped, Emily blinked up at a building that looked more like a monument than a hotel. Marble pillars, gold accents, chandeliers visible even from the street. Inside, the lobby sparkled with light, every surface gleaming. It was the kind of place where people wore diamonds to breakfast. She felt like a smudge on a painting. "Miss Carter," the concierge greeted with a polished smile. "Mr. Reid has arranged your suite. This way, please." Her suite. The elevator whisked her upward, higher and higher, until the doors opened to a view that stole her breath. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over Central Park, glittering under the dusk. The bed was bigger than her entire apartment back in Cambridge. A basket of champagne and fruit waited on the table. Emily sank onto the velvet chair, dizzy. She was nobody. A waitress who sometimes couldn't afford groceries. And yet here she was, in a world designed for kings. A knock on the door jolted her. When she opened it, Alexander Reid stood there, immaculate as ever, his suit cut sharp enough to slice. His eyes flicked over her, pausing on her dress. Something unreadable crossed his face, not disdain, not quite approval. "You came," he said simply. Emily swallowed. "I wasn't sure I should." And yet, his gaze locked with hers. "Here you are." He stepped inside, his presence filling the suite like a storm rolling in. "The dinner is tomorrow," he said. "Tonight, you rest. Tomorrow, you play your part." Her part. Emily crossed her arms, trying to steady her nerves. "And what exactly is my part?" Alexander's lips curved in the faintest, most dangerous smile she had ever seen. "You'll see." And for the first time, Emily realized she hadn't just stepped into a new world, she had stepped into his game. A game she didn't know the rules of. A game she wasn't sure she could win. But one thing was certain, once you entered Alexander Reid's world, there was no turning back. The following evening, Emily stood in front of the mirror of her suite at the Plaza Hotel in New York City, hands trembling as she adjusted the borrowed gown that had been delivered to her room. Midnight silk, smooth against her skin, with diamonds at the neckline so sharp they caught the light like fire. It wasn't hers. None of this was hers. And yet, tonight she was expected to look like she belonged among the elite of Manhattan. The driver picked her up just as the sun dipped behind the skyline, painting Central Park in shadows. The car swept her toward a penthouse in the Upper East Side, the kind of place she had only seen in glossy magazines, the kind of place where power and money dined together like old friends. When she stepped out, the cameras flashed. Not paparazzi, but discreet photographers hired for the event. She froze, startled, until Alexander's hand appeared at her back, steady and warm. "Don't look at them," he murmured. "Look at me." Emily's eyes lifted to his, and for a moment, the noise and lights faded. He offered his arm. She took it. And together, they entered the lion's den. Inside, the penthouse gleamed with crystal chandeliers, walls of glass revealing the city glittering below. Guests mingled in tuxedos and gowns worth more than Emily could make in a lifetime. Champagne flowed, violins played, and the scent of power lingered heavier than the perfume. Whispers followed them. "Is that Reid's date? She's not from here. Look at her, she doesn't fit. Maybe he bought her." Emily's stomach twisted, but she kept her chin high. She refused to be the poor orphan tonight. She refused to give them the satisfaction. Alexander introduced her sparingly. Emily Carter. He never explained who she was to him. He didn't need to. His presence at her side was explanation enough. But as the night wore on, Emily began to realize this dinner wasn't about pleasure. It was about war. She caught fragments of conversation, business rivals circling, politicians asking questions with hidden blades. And Alexander, cold and composed, parried them all with the precision of a swordsman. Until a man approached, a man with silver hair and a smile too sharp to be kind. "Reid," he said, voice smooth as oil. "And who is this lovely guest of yours?" "Emily Carter," Alexander replied evenly. "She's with me." The man's eyes slid over Emily, dismissive and curious at once. Interesting choice. Does she know what she's walked into? Emily felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could speak, Alexander's hand tightened slightly over hers. A warning. Later, when they were alone on the balcony, Emily finally asked, "Why am I here, Alexander?" Really? The city stretched below them, alive with endless light. He didn't look at her when he answered. Because they needed to see me as human. Emily blinked. Human? He turned then, his eyes sharper than the Manhattan skyline behind him. Power isolates. They want to believe I'm ice. Untouchable. Alone. But tonight, I needed them to believe I could bleed. Her breath caught. The words lingered between them like smoke. And before she could stop herself, Emily realized she wasn't just his shield. She was becoming his weakness. 2 days after the dinner, Emily found herself standing in Alexander's office at the top of Reid Tower in New York City. The view was breathtaking, floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking Manhattan, the Hudson River gleaming in the distance, the Empire State Building piercing the sky. But the man behind the desk was colder than the glass surrounding him. Alexander Reid, the Ice King, worked in silence. His tailored suit was flawless, his movements precise as he signed documents and dismissed calls with the flick of a hand. Emily shifted in her chair, feeling out of place in her thrift store shoes, even though she now wore one of the sleek dresses he'd had delivered to her closet. She wasn't sure which felt heavier, the silk against her skin or the unspoken debt she owed him. Finally, she asked, "Do you ever stop?" Alexander glanced up, his steel-gray eyes narrowing. Stop what? Working. Planning. Fighting invisible battles. Don't you ever breathe? The question hung in the air like something forbidden. For the first time since she had met him, Alexander didn't have an immediate answer. Instead, he leaned back, studying her as though she had cracked open a door he had sworn to keep locked. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Breathing is a luxury I can't afford, Emily. Not in this world. She frowned. But why? You have everything: money, power, respect. What more could you possibly need? A shadow passed over his face. He stood, walking toward the glass wall, staring out at the city as if it held ghosts only he could see. My father built this empire with his bare hands, Alexander said, his tone clipped but heavy. He taught me that weakness is the first step toward ruin. When he died, I inherited his fortune and his enemies. Every man who shakes my hand wants something. Every woman who smiles at me imagines my bank account. No one sees me. Emily's chest tightened. She had heard loneliness before, but never like this. Quietly, she stepped closer. I see you. His head turned sharply, eyes searching hers, as though daring her to mean it. The air between them shifted, charged, fragile. For a heartbeat, Alexander Reid looked less like a CEO and more like a man who had been carrying the world on his shoulders for far too long. But just as quickly, the walls slammed back up. He turned away, his voice cool again. Careful, Emily. Seeing me comes with consequences. The warning should have frightened her. It should have sent her running. But instead, she felt something reckless stir inside her chest. Later that night, when she returned to her hotel suite, Emily couldn't stop replaying his words. Not the threat. But the moment he had looked at her as if she was the first person who had ever dared to touch the cracks in his ice. And for the first time, Emily wondered if surviving the streets had been easier than surviving Alexander Reid. Because this dangerous pull between them felt like the beginning of something she couldn't escape. The charity gala in Washington, D.C. was supposed to be flawless. The ballroom at the Willard Intercontinental shimmered with crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, and the city's most powerful elite dressed in tuxedos and gowns. The press lined the red carpet outside, flashing cameras eager to capture Boston's Ice King and the mysterious woman who had begun appearing by his side. Emily Carter. She had sworn she wouldn't draw attention, but Alexander had insisted she come. If they see you with me, no one will dare question you, he had said, adjusting the diamond clasp of her borrowed necklace. His tone had been protective, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was dangerous. Inside the ballroom, whispers followed them like shadows. Some recognized Emily from the auction night, others speculated she was just another temporary beauty at the CEO's arm. She lifted her chin, pretending their words didn't sting. But Alexander noticed. His hand brushed the small of her back, his quiet gesture grounding her in the sea of judgment. For a while, the night went smoothly. Speeches, champagne toasts, polite laughter. Emily even caught Alexander smiling at her, truly smiling, as if she'd cracked through the ice again. And then it happened. The storm. A man in his 40s approached, sharp suit, sharper tongue. Victor Hayes, a rival executive from Chicago who had spent years trying to topple Reid Enterprises. His smile was venom. "So this is the reason you've been distracted, Reid," Hayes drawled loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "An orphan girl from Boston, playing dress-up in borrowed diamonds. Tell me, is she worth your empire?" The room stilled. Whispers turned into a hum of scandal. Cameras clicked. Emily froze, her chest tight with humiliation. She wanted to disappear. But before she could, Alexander stepped forward, his voice like steel. "Careful, Victor," he said, his gray eyes burning. "Emily Carter has more strength and dignity than men like you will ever understand. You speak her name again with that mouth, and I'll remind you what it feels like to lose everything." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The Ice King had never defended anyone publicly until now. Victor smirked, sensing blood. "Careful, Reid. Empires don't fall because of enemies. They fall because of weakness. And love? That's the greatest weakness of all." With that, he walked away, leaving destruction in his wake. Emily's heart pounded. She wanted to thank Alexander, to tell him his words meant more than he realized. But before she could, he caught her hand and pulled her away from the flashing cameras, into a quiet corridor. "Emily," he said, his voice low, urgent. His hand cupped her face, eyes blazing not with ice, but fire. "Do you understand what you've done to me? I told myself I couldn't afford distractions, that I couldn't let anyone close. But you, damn it, you're in my blood." Her breath caught. Alexander. Before she could say more, his lips crashed onto hers. It wasn't polite, it wasn't careful. It was years of restraint breaking in one reckless moment. She melted into him, her hands gripping his suit, her heart surrendering even as her mind screamed about consequences. When they finally broke apart, Alexander whispered against her lips, "You make me weak, Emily Carter. And I don't care." For the first time in her life, Emily wasn't afraid of her past or her scars. She was afraid of one thing only. What would happen if loving Alexander Reid destroyed them both? The morning after the gala in Washington, D.C., the storm hadn't passed, it had only grown louder. Newspapers across the United States carried the same headline. "The Ice King falls for an orphan." Alexander Reid's photograph, hand in hand with Emily, was splashed across covers from the New York Times to the Los Angeles Post. The business world buzzed with gossip, investors questioning his judgment, rivals sharpening their knives. For Emily, the whispers were crueler. "Gold digger. Nobody. She'll ruin him." Every insult clawed at her chest, but what hurt most was knowing Alexander's empire, the empire he had built from nothing, was now at risk because of her. She tried to leave. At dawn, inside his Boston penthouse overlooking the Charles River, Emily packed her small bag. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered to the empty room, "I can't let him lose everything because of me." But the moment she opened the door, Alexander was standing there, tired, disheveled, as if he hadn't slept. His gray eyes locked on hers, and his voice was a whisper edged with pain. "You were really going to leave me, Emily?" Her throat tightened. "Alexander, they'll destroy you. Your company, your reputation, everything you've worked for. I can't be the reason you lose it all." He stepped closer, cupping her trembling hands. "Listen to me. I built this empire with ice in my veins. I thought power was enough. But what's the point of all of it if I go home every night to silence?
If I can't wake up to the one person who makes me feel alive?
Emily's tears fell freely.
I'm just a girl with nothing. And you're everything. Alexander shook his head fiercely. No. You're the everything. Don't you see? You're the only thing in this world I was missing. For a long moment, the world fell away.
Just them, two broken souls clinging to each other against the storm.
And then came the final test. Victor Hayes, desperate to ruin Alexander, filed a hostile takeover attempt of Reid Enterprises. Stocks dipped, headlines screamed, and Washington insiders whispered of Alexander's downfall. But Alexander didn't fight alone.
For the first time, Emily stood beside him publicly, not in borrowed diamonds, but in her own strength. At a press conference in New York City, cameras flashing, she spoke into the microphone, her voice steady.
You call me weak because I was an orphan. But losing everything taught me how to fight. And loving Alexander doesn't make him weaker.
It makes him stronger, because real power isn't in money or titles.
It's in knowing what you're willing to fight for. The room went silent.
Even the press, hungry for blood, couldn't deny the fire in her words. Alexander's hand found hers, his eyes shining with pride.
And for once, the Ice King wasn't untouchable, he was human. And the world saw it not as weakness, but as truth. In the weeks that followed, the takeover failed. Investors rallied behind Alexander, impressed by his defiance and by the woman who had stood fearless at his side. Victor Hayes disappeared into obscurity, his empire crumbling. And Emily Carter? She was no longer the orphan. She was the woman who had melted Boston's Ice King. On a quiet evening months later, Alexander took her to Central Park in New York, beneath the glowing city lights. He knelt, not as a billionaire CEO, but as a man stripped of pride, holding out a ring. Emily Carter, he whispered, voice trembling with something deeper than power. Be my family. My home. My forever. Her answer was tears, laughter, and the word she never thought she'd be brave enough to say. Yes. As his arms wrapped around her, Emily realized the truth. Love hadn't destroyed them. It had saved them. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't surviving. She was living.